Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this latest edition of Wellbeing Wins with the great Al Kingsley and the awesome Ferdy. Thank you, Al and Ferdy, so much for joining us.
Hello, hello. Lovely to be here.
I say it is always a pleasure to see you, Al, but an absolute joy to see Ferdy in real life. Not AI Ferdy, the real one this time. Been a very good boy, obviously well trained.
He is well trained, but he was most excited about his appearance fee, so that's why he's turned up.
Oh, sorry, Al. We didn't discuss that before. That's something we can discuss maybe a bit later. So yeah, hopefully, well, he's obviously becoming quite a big name with your newsletter. But Ferdy, thank you so much. Ferdy, any thoughts from you on EdTech and what's going on, the latest trends?
I think the technical term is he's having a pause for thought.
Oh, very good. Very good. Genuinely, that's just off the cuff stuff as well. Al, thank you so much for giving up some of your time. We know you're a super busy man. For people that don't know who you are, if you're not an EdTech person or you haven't met Al before, please could you give us? I know you've got very long titles and lots of titles. Could you give us who Al Kingsley is in a nutshell?
Well, most of them aren't that exciting. I usually try and keep a really short and simple a man of two hats. So one half in my commercial role, Group CEO of NetSupport for the last 30 years. I also chair our Combined Authority Business Board for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough region. But Edu, as everyone will know, is my passion. So I'm chair of a multi-academy trust, sit on the DfE's advisory board for the East of England for many years. I chair an infant school and sort of crossing between the two, I chair the BESA EdTech group, apprenticeship ambassador, export ambassador, all sorts of fun things, but all passionate and linked back to skills, opportunities, education, and how technology sometimes can be the right enabler.
You're another one of those people. I was a PE teacher for a long time, thinking I was really busy, didn't have time for anything. And then I left teaching and met lots of people like you that do about 20 things. And I don't know how on earth you do it, but you do manage to do it. And thank you for that intro. And NetSupport has always been, really lovely support for us at youHQ. I put on LinkedIn this week how my first ever interview about anything to do with youHQ was with you and Mark Anderson on the Check It Out show. So it's really lovely to go full circle and have you on our webinar. What about something that people don't know about you? I was quite interested to know a bit more about Al Kingsley, younger Al, not saying that you're old, but younger Al Kingsley, who you were before you were all these various different things, CEO of NetSupport and everything else. What's your background in before that?
Goodness. Well, NetSupport and education has been a large part of my career. When I decided to get out into the big wide world, originally I had a short stay in Barclays Bank, which was definitely not a fit for me. They have processes and rules for everything that was set decades ago, and anybody who wants to be innovative really doesn't fit in. That was my view anyway. So I then worked in Unilever and worked in Unilever in finance. And it was just at the point when technology was starting to go from being a building to an item on a desk. And I found the item on the desk and that much more interesting than my career in finance in Unilever. So I stepped away and started working individually with organizations to help them with their technology. And then we had our first child and education popped up. So I very much got interested in that, got involved in school governance. And at the same time, my interest with technology, I met with somebody who'd been developing remote management, remote control technology. And we kind of evolved that together. And then it became, well, if we can use remote management tools in the commercial world, couldn't we use them in the classroom? And rather than be 500 miles away, how about if all the computers were 5 feet away and we could actually support learning in the classroom? After that, my journey just continued. Moved to the US, spent a few years working in school system across in the US, back to the UK. And I'm very fortunate that I've been able to follow my passion on both strands across my career.
Lovely to hear that, again, you as a parent's kind of giving you that passion for education. I think it's very, very similar to myself and John. We often talk about, people say, why did you do this? And I think when you become a parent, your outlook changes, doesn't it? So that's really lovely to hear. Thank you for sharing that. So Al, you do cover so many different things. To start with, can we talk about what's coming up for you at the moment with EdTech? Obviously, I didn't even know the word existed 4 or 5 years ago, and now that's what I describe myself as, someone in EdTech. What's the latest in the space? Obviously, AI has been everywhere. I know you talk a lot about it. Is something really coming through for you at the moment? And what are the big changes that you've seen really recently?
You know, we love in education to have a shortened version, abbreviation of everything. So, you know, educational technology, it kind of is what it says. It's an all-encompassing term. And if you actually look at modern schools, and particularly multi-academy trusts or school districts or international school clusters, the technology base, actually there's more technology outside the classroom than in the classroom. They are highly connected digital entities. And I'm all about looking to find the economies of scale and the way that technology can allow people to do their people things better. The topics of the day, without a doubt, AI pops up all the time. Interestingly, most of the online talk is rightly about generative AI and how we can use that tool in teaching and learning. Most schools have already got AI, but it's non-generative AI, the functionality that allows you to interrogate large amounts of data and can identify for you whether it's gaps in learning or is used as a personalized learning tool to support children's stretch and challenge and reinforcing understanding. And the generative AI, much of the conversation at the moment is actually focused, because of the pressures on our system, around reduction in teacher workload. And then we're just seeing more creative and innovative ways that we take and use generative AI within teaching and learning. But that has a direct correlation to refining the way that we consider assessment when we have students access to it. But, you know, the world is changing. And the thing that really, you know, ignites me is that the workplace is changing. It's not only hybrid, but we're seeing these tools and technologies being adopted at a really rapid rate. And so that concept of skills becomes ever more prevalent in equipping our learners for the new digital workplace. And so I'm very passionate about all of those critical thinking skills, cognitive skills, you know, checking, validating information, but also, you know, the innovation and imagination, the creative elements that are makes us human beings what we are. So that's happening now. Of course, all these things use data, and so there's a big conversation about effective use of data, and alongside that, data privacy, data protection, putting guardrails in place to keep our learners safe on their journey. There are always conversations around things like XR, extended reality, that combination of virtual reality, augmented reality. I kind of get a sense that's kind of blown big and gone a bit cold again. And we've been looking to find ways to use the tools rather than identify the need first. But things happen at such a pace that we constantly see change. Probably the most important thing I see in my schools and in schools that I go to work with and support is, you know, we focus on our priorities in our schools, and we look at measures of impact whenever we do anything. And we're kind of pre-programmed, and typically in schools, when we look at impact when it comes to teaching and learning, we're very much focused around, you know, progress, attainment, those kind of key indicators. But I think increasingly we're becoming much more conscious that when it comes to the priority list, social, emotional, mental health, well-being, teacher workload, recruitment and retention, finance, sadly, those are far more important drivers. And actually, if we don't get the bedrock right of people and staff being in the right place, how on earth can we expect most effective output from all of those stakeholders? So there's a very much a looking around, what do we actually mean by evidence informed, whether in this case it's EdTech, and we need to start kind of broadening the lens on how we measure impact. Not everything we do with technology in a school ultimately is about a child suddenly learns more this week or this year. Sometimes it just actually frees up more time for a teacher to provide social support and emotional support for a child because technology is doing some of the grunt work for them. Maybe it's reducing teacher workload in the evenings by creating lesson plans of content as drafts, and that has simply a material benefit on our staff, and thank goodness. Sometimes it's around actually economies of scale. Can we work more efficiently, reduce some of our costs? That means we've got a bit more in the pot for the important stuff. So all these things are interconnected. And then depending on where you are in the world, you know, here in the UK, it's a big landscape and narrative around growth of our school system. And that's largely driven by economies of scale, and bigger entities, multi-academy trusts, potentially have more centralized resource to support school improvement and much broader. And so it's linking that understanding growth strategies with the fact that technology can be a real enabler, can be a lever in allowing trusts to flex more effectively. You know, and all these things come back to, we all talk about technology, but the real power of technology is to free up more time for the human to human interaction. And if we remember that as being the kind of the goal, I think we kind of reset the conversation a little bit.
I love that. I love you finishing with that point, that that great use of technology that will facilitate real relationships, because I think often we come up against the negative flip of that, which is that technology can replace human interaction. And I love that sentiment, that you actually real genuine use of technology to free up time. You sound to me like you're a pretty big fan of technology to, let's look at the teacher side, for example. We hear a lot, again, teachers, they are overwhelmed, stretched, possibly underpaid in some places, leaving the job. Is it that bad? And are you a big fan of AI and other technologies to free up that time for teachers to do their jobs properly?
We've got a challenge at both ends. We've got a challenge with the recruitment, and we've got a challenge at retention, particularly at more senior levels. And people are saying, why do I want to continue doing this? Is it worth it for me? So technology, absolutely, where used with purpose. And I think that's really important, because, some of the best lessons don't use any technology at all, and thank goodness. But I think if we look in the overall ecosystem of our schools, technology absolutely can be something that can do the legwork on the things that don't require that kind of spark of human. Although you're always going to need the human to human element. I think when we talked about AI a few years ago, and certainly in the last 18 months, it suddenly came to the fore, courtesy of ChatGPT and then all the variants that came thereafter. Most people's understanding of AI was a robot that can think for itself. And in truth, it's not going to replace teachers' jobs. In many ways, it's going to amplify the need for that human-to-human interaction, but it also highlights the need to understand how to effectively and safely use artificial intelligence for impact and for benefit. So like most things that happen in education, one part is about support and nurture, and one part is about, have we got the right training, the right CPD to build confidence? Because confidence is the king in all these conversations. Effective and successful use of EdTech is by practitioners who are confident with the tools and understand where it's appropriate to use. Children don't suddenly wake up, digital natives or not, with the understanding of how to use the tools within the school effectively. And so they need training and support and CPD. Tools are nothing without the right human steer and the right appropriate implementation. There are other conversations going on. You hear lots. Fiona Aubrey-Smith's been sharing some great stuff on PedTech, put a P at the front for pedagogy, which is very much that concept that all of our decisions around the use of technology should be pedagogy driven. And there's absolute merit in that when we think within the teaching and learning sphere. As I alluded to, if we think about the whole technology ecosystem within our school, there are times where actually it needs to be technology driven for different reasons, because it's about security and interoperability and flexibility. But fundamentally, the most successful use of technology is where educators can steer a direction of travel with the advice support of the technical team within the school. And actually, it's the effective collaboration of both those sides that is where you really see the sweet spot of innovation.
You mentioned training of teachers, Al. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think there needs to be a lot of work put into not only the technology side, but we find a lot in the teachers that we talk to that they love the concept of supporting mental health, well-being, personal development, but they don't feel equipped often. That's not every teacher. Many teachers do feel happy doing that, but a lot of our teachers say, well, I wasn't trained to do this. I didn't sign up for this. Do you see then does there need to be some change in the training of teachers? Is that a big part of the problem with recruitment and retention?
I think training is one angle. I'm not sure it's the complete, certainly not the complete picture when it comes to recruitment and retention. I think the general challenge is if a job needs doing, or a new policy comes out, or a new expectation on the education system comes out, it just magically appears on the bottom of the job description of each teacher, and in many cases support staff. So we've got a glass that's full that we keep pouring more and more expectations into. And when it comes to CPD, I either use a very clumsy analogy. Well, if our educators were a football team, right now what we do is give them a day and a half's training at the start of the year and tell them we'll see you in the cup final. Well, that isn't very effective in football. And yet often we think when it comes to professional development, that's pretty much what happens within the academic cycle. And anything new we do, we somehow expect staff to soak that up in their free time. Head to YouTube, read these notes. And I think we need to be really mindful that one of the key things that we can do to support recruitment and retention is empower staff. And empowerment comes with having more confidence in what they're asked to do and have the right training and support to do it. I always say that the two most important things that any person wants in their career, in their job, and we'll put salary and other bits to one side, is one, to feel valued and trusted, and the second is to have some sense of autonomy. And being valued and trusted means that people say, I really want you to be skilled up on this, or I want you to lead on this because I trust your judgment and insight, or I want to add capabilities to your toolkit. And on the other side is, I want to be able to do this without having to constantly say, can you give me a help or a pointer? And both those strands fundamentally require the sense you've got to provide the appropriate support and CPD, first of all, to make sure that everybody feels that they're equipped with the task in hand, albeit a task that keeps on changing in education.
Thanks, Al. There's been a big announcement this week. You may have heard there's going to be a general election coming up. I know that you sit on lots of different boards and you work with the Department for Education and you wear these many different hats that we mentioned. You also referenced in one of your recent newsletters the Ofsted Big Listen concept. Where do you see Ofsted and any potential change in government? Where do you see that going, or where would you like to see that going? It's a difficult question.
It is.
Is there obvious changes that you would like to see happen?
I certainly am not a fan of the current inspection framework. Having been through 3 in the last year, I'll say the first thing is there's not consistency, and that is often the most important challenge. But I think consistently what I do see is on a 2-day inspection, at the end of day 1, there is always some sense of the sword of Damocles is left handling. Things are looking good, but I'd like this, this, and this by 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I see the team working till 8, 9 o'clock at night. And I certainly think, well, that doesn't reflect on somebody who's recognizing the need for balancing staff well-being. I also don't think we've made a nod towards well-being by saying, if you feel like you're struggling with this inspection, you can call this number. Well, say to a professional, a head leading a school, you might as well just be direct and say to them, if you feel you can't cope with an inspection, ring this number. And of course, no one's going to feel comfortable doing that because they want to get the most for their school and the staff have put so much effort in. I'm not a fan of Ofsted in the format as it sits right now. I know many people talk about the one-word judgments, and that is an issue, but I think it's also a side issue. I think the most important aspect is, what are we trying to achieve? Well, the one valuable bit of an inspection is actually the feedback at the end. And that's in the last hour of the inspection process, where you get constructive feedback about areas for development. And often they resonate and they make perfect sense. And I always think, if you're going to try and do a process, the process is to empower the school to move forward, not to whack them over the head. And so for me, there's much more could be done to make that collegiate. At the moment, often some inspection teams, it feels quite combative. The reason why I kind of pause on the one-word inspection titles, and I don't think they're particularly helpful, I think they're really quite clumsy, is there's always going to be a need somewhere in the system to identify schools that are underperforming, because ultimately we're here to make sure our children get the best experience. And where they're underperforming, we need to be able to identify that and put in measures, challenge to make sure we can move forward. Yeah, if I had a magic wand, I'd be saying, if schools were requiring improvement, I'd be saying you're going to need to address these key items, and here's the breakdown of points over the next 2 years. And by the way, here's some extra funding that comes with being an RI to allow you to actually deliver that change. Something that happens in the US education system after their NAEP ratings each year. But that can be a bit of a roller coaster. You get some funding to deliver improvement, the funding gets taken away, things decline, and so on. So I think we could be less clumsy than the current ratings. I think we could see it as a collegiate process of how can we support you. Obviously, I wear a role at the Department for Education on the Regional Advisory Board for the East of England. And one of the things that Ofsted holds as a bit of a Damocles for schools is, if you get a double RI, you don't get a choice, but you'll be instructed that you've got to go and join an academy. And that can really be seen as a kind of a huge challenge. Now, sometimes the intention, in fact, in my experience, all times, the intention is we need to put you with a multi-academy trust that's got capacity and team to provide you with the support to move and deliver that change and improvement. And they've got the capacity to do that. But if you don't have any kind of measure or rating of a school, firstly, you can't do that. And secondly, there is a risk that underperforming schools go unnoticed, and we have an obligation to parents to have a sense. I just think we could be much more detailed or specific in terms of writing a few paragraphs about the school and the school's strengths and its areas for development than necessarily putting a badge on the door, particularly when we're trying to find ways for delivering on our challenges when it comes to teacher recruitment. Because you get a bad judgment, it doesn't help you when it comes to teacher recruitment. So it almost now we're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. So there's quite a few points there. The biggest one for me, I think, more than anything else, is an inspection shouldn't be quite such a stressful process for everybody. There should be an opportunity for us to see how we're doing and what we need to do next to move on. And I think currently there is just too much inconsistency in inspectors that, frankly, give the impression of having something to prove. And I just don't think that's helpful to anybody.
Do you think it's interesting that the independent schools inspectorate have gone down the route of taking away the one-word judgment? I was speaking to a local school to me yesterday, and I agree with you for whatever that's worth. He actually said it was almost quite frustrating not to get the word that they were searching for, which was interesting.
Well, it's a difficult one, isn't it? We often it's not unique to education. We will on one hand say, well, we don't really, I certainly agree that an Ofsted inspection to me doesn't capture the essence of our school. If we think about the things that we're most proud of in our school, it's about our vision, our values, our community, our ethos, our relationship with our children. And many of those things aren't reflected when we look at the key indicators from an Ofsted inspection. So in that sense, it doesn't capture the essence. But the problem we have is we will turn around at sometimes and say, well, I don't think an Ofsted inspection is a fair reflection of me, unless we've got an outstanding, in which case we'll be very quick to say our school's outstanding, or yoo-hoo, we got a good. And so we kind of use it in a positive way when it suits, and we somewhat disregard it when it doesn't. And I don't think that helps either, frankly. I personally would rather not see the singular words, but I think it's not to replace it with nothing. There needs to be a bit more narrative and context that reflects, and I think it's incumbent on the inspection team to make sure that they also focus on the positives around the broader child and the life in the school than just purely on some of those key indicators. One thing that's quite interesting linked around that, Jez, is I worked for a couple of years co-chairing a work stream with the Fed, who were working with the OECD. And as you know, the OECD produced the PISA rankings, our high-performing school systems all around the world for 15-year-old children. And there's a sense of, it is pretty much, isn't it? It's a league table of performance based on subject capture is not that dissimilar to the EBAC kind of subjects that we have in the UK. And they're working on a new assessment, broader assessment, which is a system built around, to use the correct term, built on human flourishing, which really says, you absolutely don't disregard the ability to acquire knowledge and skills, but actually there's much broader sense of skills that we want to actually fine tune into that, as well as a child's sense of awe and wonder and what inspires them. And I think if we look at the breadth of our measurement of a good school system, do we say that the school system that has children in rows learning by rote to the exam and then leave at 18 thinking never again, that was what I endured? Or do we look at a school system that provides a real breadth of subjects to support all learners' needs, is very much focused around support and nurture, isn't always just chasing the grades, and a child leaves with a love of learning they want to take on into their adult lives? Now, I'm using extremes just to kind of provide the example, but I think there's absolutely something in there about what's most important to me. In our trust, whilst we're always judged on the outward data, I would happily sacrifice a few points on the data to have a broader, more caring, an enriching environment in our schools. And sometimes you have to try and say, well, I'm going to put subjects on for some of our learners to make sure we've got something for everybody. But in doing that, it may not help us on those dashboards. But you know what? Morally, that's not why we're there.
Can trusts be bold like that? How restricted are trusts, Al, in trying to, I don't know whether thinking outside the box is the right way to put it, but like you said, can trusts go, okay, we've got to stay within this framework? John spoke to one Leicestershire way the other day, and they seemed super bold. They wanted to go really in on the values, character education. Yes, of course, they still are accountable to the academic data, but how bold can they be?
Well, without, if we take the consideration of finance being, an unlimited pot, within the core delivery of those curriculum subjects that a school is expected, we could broaden that subject range significantly. We can choose to put more vocational subjects on that support the breadth of our learners' needs. In our case, we can have 2 secondary school sixth forms, and we can create a joint sixth form, so we can have a much broader choice provision to meet all of our learners' needs. We can be bold and say, in order to join our sixth form, we're not expecting you to get all grade 7s, but we're going to set the threshold to be inclusive rather than be chasing our outcomes. There are some trusts that are now starting to get quite creative and innovative when it comes to teacher retention. So, we've got a fixed number of days, 190 whatever days it is of teaching that's got to be delivered each year. We've got some trusts saying we're going to add an extra 5 minutes to each day and have a 2-week half term in the autumn term. That adds an extra holiday. It's an appeal to staff. I mean, it doesn't come without challenge from parents because there's childcare issues around that. But saying there's different ways that we need to meet the needs of making the profession doable and making the workload for staff bearable. And in some markets in the UK to a degree, but again, money dictates, certainly with my work in the UAE, and I know you folks have got many schools you work with over there. Technology often has been used to really innovate and to be a bit of a shop window for the international schools. You could argue that's partly linked to recruiting fee-paying parents, but it's also about being in the position financially where they can actually be at the forefront of innovating and trying things. And sometimes you've got to innovate to figure out what does and doesn't work, but that ripples through to the state systems over time. So it's always good to keep an eye to other markets to understand where new technology is being woven in and how effective it proves to be.
As a former teacher who finished in the independent sector, that 2-week October half term, I have to say, was an absolute game changer. And, I remember conversations with staff saying that's often such a tough term, isn't it? That first one back, you've had the big summer break. You really do genuinely feel like you need it. I know there might be people listening that aren't teachers and there's often that idea that teachers get all this time off, but they really do work so hard. And I think that's an interesting concept. And as husband of a wife who is on a plane to LA and she could go today because her school gave her a wellbeing day leading into half term, I think those sorts of gestures are actually really, really important. That meant the world to my wife to be able to go today rather than having to get right through to the end of the week. So yeah, that's interesting. I wanted to pick up on something I heard you say. I think it was in a recent podcast. You said soft skills are power skills. I really like that because I was trying to think of a good way to say soft skills because it always comes out like they're not important because of the language. And I couldn't think of a good one. I obviously really like that one. I know that you have this passion for lots of things, but I know you have a passion for the holistic development of the child. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on how EdTech sits with overall holistic development of the child. You've mentioned that obviously schools and trusts are always going to be held accountable probably towards the value added with academic. Where do you see that holistic development, personal development side of things? Do you think we're trying to raise the priority of that somehow, whether that's through Ofsted or how schools are being judged or how MATs are working with the schools? Where do you see that fitting in?
It is at the moment to kind of forces pressing in different directions. How do I fit all the curriculum expectations into the working week, and at the same time make much more time for the nurture of the child and their development. And I think schools are desperate to do it. Frankly, people aren't in education for any other reason other than to try and do the right thing and support young people. But it's absolutely a challenge. But I think there's elements of it that come down to culture. I'm very fortunate, much as I chair a MAT and have my other roles, that I'm chair of a small infant school, inner city infant school in Peterborough. I'm happy to do a shout out to Dogsthorpe Infants, who are very proud to dream, believe and shine. And there's so much that's about the space and the culture there. We want to deliver the children's best possible chances. But we also want a place and a space where children feel safe and have an opportunity to be children, and to try and do things in a very accessible way. And sometimes that's just about how much time do we actually provide for more free flow creative play for our learners in their most formative years. How can we inspire them? bought in a disused coach. We painted it as our Dream Believe Shine Journey bus. We took the seats out bar a few. We put in some VR headsets. We put in tablets for using for augmented reality. And the children go on learning journeys. They get on the bus, they sit on there, and they've got different adventures. And it will then spark ideas that can weave into their vocabulary, their creative and ideas, give them stimulus to go away and role play in the things that we do. Lots of the things are about nurturing the breadth, and it ties in, because when we say soft skills are power skills, what does an employer want from somebody now? And we've got specialisms. If you're a doctor, I get you probably need to have been to university and got your medical degree. But in the broader sense of employment, we want people who are resilient, who are innovative, that are critical thinkers, that can evidence and check quantity, that are strong communicators, that are emotionally resilient, all these things, those soft skills that are now very much in the orbit of being power skills. Those are the things that we want to develop. Well, you don't do that when a child's 18. You do it from the very beginning, where a child always feels that they have a voice. And you do it in lots of creative ways. We have Eddie, the wellbeing dog, the head's dog, that comes in once a week. Ferdy's certainly made quite a few visits in school. And for some learners, sitting and reading to a dog is a safer way of doing it than they might want to an adult. Thinking how assistive technology, can level the playing field for accessibility. That's a really important one, because sometimes we wrongly think, well, the more tech we've got in our school, the better we're doing, right? Well, no, because it's not about who's got the most tech. It's about who's using the tech with purpose. And there's a risk that you have so much tech that actually it becomes inaccessible to some of your more vulnerable learners. And so actually finding that balance to say, actually, we want to use technology that levels the playing field. Ideally, when we introduce a tool, I don't want it to be for some students. I want it to be for all students. No child wants to feel like they've got something different. So understanding where technology can actually develop and broaden things. I've been to a number of mats. I was down at Woodland Academy Trust, who are using in their primaries, really wrapped around universal design for learning, but using technology to allow learners to engage in learning in different ways. And you're seeing children doing their PE classes, something will resonate with you, Jez, but they've got their iPads with them and they're recording them trying to do different gymnastic things and coming back 2 weeks later and comparing footage and looking at how they've done things differently, critiquing each other, but actually starting to create their own work around it. And older children, we're seeing, well, never mind GPTs, you can chat GPT, you can have a GPT, which is with your own lockdown data set. And schools are doing project-based learning, where the students are helping create the tools that will support other students in different ways on different topics. So I think all the time we're looking and thinking about, we want to be stimulating children's innovation and creativity to provide them with that opportunity to nurture. If I had a magic wand, we certainly wouldn't be having what I would call outward formative assessment in primary schools. I think it steers the time spent in the curriculum to, I'm not saying that all schools teach to the test, but we're forced down a path where, whether it's our phonics or whether it's our SATs, it takes a large amount of time and creates pressure for staff. And no matter what we say, for students and for different students, a different amount of stress. So I think we could reduce that down, and then the other end, when we come to assessments, conversation I had recently is, the most important qualifications we probably acquire during our careers are our university degrees. And this most important qualification, we're happy to judge over 3 years of continuous assessment, through exams, through questions, through different submissions, with a final exam at the end that counts for a little bit. And we say that's okay, and it's marked and graded internally by the university. And then we go back one stage and we say A levels, and we say, no. For those, you've got to remember everything for 2 years, and we're going to test you in 2 2-hour slots. And that's the only way we can validate the authenticity of your A level. And obviously, we'll need to send the grades of the papers out somewhere else to have them tested and validated. And still, we don't think, hang on a second, is that fair and equitable for all of our learners? Is that the right way? I had 2 years I was asked to step in to chair an alternative provision academy for children that really struggled in the mainstream setting. And the conversations I had with some of those learners, I thought, if I give you a pen and paper and say, write down what you know on this subject, I'm going to get a few lines of paper before I'm told I don't see the point or this isn't for me. If I sat down and said to you, speak into the computer or speak to me and we'll record it, tell me all you know about this subject, the amount of information I could capture to evidence that child's understanding is completely different. So because we don't make the different ways of showcasing our understanding accessible, we provide a system that is always going to be one where for some learners, this just doesn't feel like it works for me and I'm just being set up for failure. And then we wonder why nationally we have a problem and a crisis with attendance now.
So in essence, you believe that schools should have an element, there should be an element of choice for students, for the diversity of learning styles for students, so it's not so prescriptive. So you don't all sit down at the end. And I'm totally, I've seen it with my boys as they're getting to secondary school age, and my son's just sat his SATs and hated it and really struggled. So yeah, I really agree with you. Do you also think then, Al, that hearing you talk about the power skills, and you're the second CEO I've heard speak in the last month about how important these skills are from an employability point of view. She even said she wasn't flippant enough, the other CEO, to say they don't matter, because obviously grades open doors and you might not even get looked at without the grades, which is a shame. Would you like to see a system where these skills are interwoven into academic success, rather than it being here's academic grades and value added, and over here there's some element of skills, and how they're captured, we're not really sure. Would you like to see them embedded together a bit more?
I think so. I think the truth of it is we need to understand that for every child, your measure of what's great about you, the skills that you have that are of value, aren't necessarily all the things that we currently hand out certificates for. And that's not fair. But they also need to understand that those traits that we're talking about now in an ever digital world potentially make you special, because it's your human skills that will allow you to stand out from the crowd in an ever digital world. And I think that is one of the most sort of fundamental levers of how we look when we're trying to assess moving forward. I mean, as an organization, when we recruit people, obviously with developers, we do a few tests about their coding skills, give them a few problems to solve. But beyond that, we interview and we meet people. I interview personality and potential, people that have got a hunger and an appetite to prove that they can do the job. All they want is an opportunity and get taught what they need to know to do it. I'm very much a fan of grow your own. And that's worked for us. The average staff retention in our organization is 13 years. That's the average. And it's about, again, in most of those cases, I have to say it quietly for teachers, I certainly want students to hear it, I don't spend much time looking at their qualifications. Now, sadly, in some sectors, qualifications become the first sift of the applications when there's high demand for jobs, and that's a convenient way of just sifting to the top. But as we get more savvy as employers, and I'm by no means diminishing academic achievement. My daughter did very well at university, then went on and did her master's and has a very successful career in the city. I want pathways that suit each and every child, but I also think we need to be kind of mindful that where some will sift for it and some will have it as a core requirement in large organizations, unless you've got these qualifications. Back to my example, if you're a doctor, I'm going to hope you've got the right qualifications. But in other roles, when it comes to dealing, whether it's marketing, whether it's sales, whether it's customer support, interaction, innovation, actually those skills are much more important. And if you've got an aptitude and a willingness to learn, then the rest is almost on me to give you the opportunity.
If there are adults out there or students, children who are passionate about what we're saying, where should people go, whether they're in EdTech or parents or teachers? Where's a good place to go to start trying to push for some sort of change? Is it the Ofsted Big Listen website? I mean, where would you recommend?
It's really hard because actually, who is listening? I mean, I don't want to sound negative here, folks, but one of the biggest challenges is our education system is back from the times of the British Empire. We had a standardized approach to learning numeracy and literacy that meant you could be picked up from anywhere, whether it was England or Canada or India or Australia, and drop somewhere in the empire, and you had the skills to get behind a desk and do those jobs that were needed. And it hasn't really advanced much since in many regards. And please, this is about policy, not about practitioners for sure. But what we also find, and this is where politics kicks in, particularly given this week and the topic on hand, is that when we look at reform and change, sadly, most of the time we want things that we can start and finish within an electoral cycle. Parties want to be able to evidence what they did has got an output, and that output, of course, can have political capital. But fundamentally, what we need to do in education is about long-term systematic change. And so it's about having somebody who's bold enough to say, I'm going to start this, but I'm not going to be in a position to get the credit for it in the short term. And it really needs to be a non-political topic in terms of how we reform the education system to make it fit for purpose. So I say that with a sense that with all best intentions, whilst people, it's important, I think, to share their views and articulate what they are, it is really limited in terms of how do we get involved. There are great organizations like the Fed, the Foundation for Education Development, that are always looking. They're constantly holding events and opportunities for your voice to be shared. I'd really encourage talking to them, because they're looking at creating a long-term plan for education. So that's a great spot. Yes, things like the Big Listen are great. I don't think its credibility was helped when the government made its announcement in terms of the one-word gradings before the listen had finished, but that's just politics and practice colliding, sadly. But you have to live in hope that that will continue. There's an alternative Big Listen that's online at the moment where you can submit. I covered that in one of my newsletter a couple of weeks ago, where you can share views. There are, certainly in my newsletter, I always try and share links where people are looking for feedback and insights. But actually, the most important thing I think what we can do is by building our own PLN, we develop a network with others who are finding ways to excel in spite of the limitations. And I think that's where we always have to look. We're naturally persuaded to look from within in our schools, but actually some of the best practices is all around us, but now in a digital world, all around the world. And I want to learn what did work, but also what didn't work, so that we don't waste time and do the same things. And what I do see is the most amazing community of people sharing their insights, their work, their resources, their guidance for the betterment of everybody. Something you wouldn't see in the commercial space, because that would be, if you had some secret source to success, you'd want to keep it as a competitive advantage. And yet here we are in education, and everybody shares the good, the bad, and the ugly whenever they can.
Where do you see the mental health crisis, Al? Do you see it as a crisis in the work you do? Do you see, do you think schools should be in a position where they should be supporting the mental health and
I wear a
wellbeing?
different hat for this one. Another one of my hats is I'm the independent chair of our SEND board. And so I was asked to do that, I suppose, probably as the noisy one that would provide challenge, which I try to do. Yes, I do think we're in a crisis position right now, and I think it's extending. I see it in schools, the challenge between children finding the pressure and the experience of the school system being too much for them to be able to handle and cope with. I see a massive pressure on our mainstream schools being asked to provide the support and nurture for young people where it really isn't the best setting. I see there are a lack of capacity and available places in specialist provisions that would suit children's needs. Whether it's in specialist provisions, whether it's in mainstream setting, there is a real lack of resources and support. There's a national lack. Been the same conversation for probably the last 10 years on educational psychologists and others to allow children to get through that EHA, CP process. Lots of these things comes down to capacity, doesn't it? It's time and capacity. And it comes back to my point at the very beginning, which is if we're not in the right place to learn, then no matter what interventions we try and put into learning, we're not going to get the maximum potential. And I think that starts with how do we facilitate and enable our learners to have greater awareness themselves, just to kind of capturing where they're at and how they're feeling. Sometimes it's a sense of I'm not being heard. Then we can give them the kind of advice and strategies of how they're going to actually perhaps self-reflect and look at ways to support and nurture them, which I think is also really important. Inspiring positivity, getting the right habits in place. We always in our schools want to try and focus on where we can look at proactive interventions and be aware of what's happening in the world. I also have a different hat for many Sunday mornings for the last few years as a childline advisor. I dial in particularly at periods where Christmas time, where they're really short of people to be on childline. And that's one where you see and hear some really sad stories of young people not feeling heard, and in really difficult and challenging places. So lots of those things, and you might have guessed by the things that I shared as those key points, it's a kind of a model built around something like Appia, Jez, which I know you would be familiar with because it's built around your framework. But it is that sense, which is like everything. It's a bit like online safety, you know. We've got tools, you know, including something that NetSupport does to keep our learners safe online. But the holy grail is to empower the child to keep themselves safe. And in the same sense, when it comes to well-being, we want to provide all the wraparound care and nurture for our learners. But it's actually the holy grail is to try and equip our learners with the tools so that they can be self-reflective and they can build and develop their own well-being and resilience themselves. You know, and I think that segues very nicely into what all this conversation when it comes to well-being and wins is about.
And yeah, and it also comes back to probably your power skills, which is, you know, actually educating young people that they can have some agency over this, and, you know, it's not totally out of their control. So actually, you know, it sounds to me there are obviously lots of things that can be done, but actually building it, giving the student some agency, giving the student the feeling, enabling them to feel like they can cope, they can develop things like, you know, the word resilience. I know it's overused and comes up all the time, but building that early on is really important to give them the opportunity to be able to cope with tough things that are inevitably going to come up in their lives.
Well, maybe I don't get my definitions right all the time, but when I said at the beginning, the things that we as adults value most in terms of being valued, trusted, having a voice, having autonomy, I reckon they're pretty important strands in the sense of agency for a young person. It's not something that's massively unique. I think the sense of giving a child a sense of voice and a sense of control over how they move forward, how they tackle their well-being, how their voices are heard, and sometimes how they can shape the way that they are treated or how they engage with their learning. The more we create agency, you know, the more in any organization, you know, student voice in our schools is fundamental. And we often talk about it, but don't necessarily get as proactive and really constantly monitoring and understanding how our children are feeling, their moods, and where they are with their well-being. You know, in the same way as when it comes to staff well-being, the number of schools and MATs that say, yeah, we do staff well-being. What is that? Well, it's an email that goes out every Friday night. And it's like, well, firstly, we could just start by sending out less emails, and certainly not on a Friday night. And secondly, an email of here's the numbers to ring if you have a problem is not delivering on well-being. Well-being is about how can we be more proactive in advance? How can we reduce things down rather than always just focusing on the staff changing their behaviors? You know, so I think it is fundamental because we're only seeing the challenge grow in terms of young people struggling with accessing full-time mainstream education. I think the world will change and there will be more hybrid and online learning experiences and opportunities for learners that will fit. But it has to be a priority. If we're not prioritizing well-being, then as I've said a couple of times now, you know, I think all bets are off in terms of expecting them to perform to their maximum academically, as well as their acquisition of skills and be in the best place to be given the maximum choices when it comes to their future workplace. You know, the one thing I love about digital and recently is that we are starting to break down the place-based barriers. It doesn't matter where you're born or what family you were born in and how wealthy they were. You know, if you are able to flourish during your educational journey, you can stay at home and you can apply for a job in Silicon Valley or Timbuktu. You know, the barriers are down in some regards, but at the same time, competition has increased because that person in Timbuktu can apply for a job in your town. And so with that, I think we very much put an onus on actually the shining part is if we can nurture that well-being in our learners, if we can help them foster those really powerful skills that will help them shine not only outwardly but inwardly in their adult lives, then that's probably the most valuable commodity we can give them.
Amazing, Al. Thank you so much. Honestly, we could talk to you for so long because you know so much about so many different things, and it's really, I think that's a really nice place for us to finish talking about your specific expertise in education. I would like to know a little bit more about what you've got coming up over the next few weeks. There's obviously really only one half term left of most of the schools are out there. I know we've got international schools and slightly different things. What's going on for you for like the next couple of months?
The biggest one in my diary for the next month is heading across to Denver for ISTE, the sort of US's biggest educational conference. I'm going to be speaking there. I'm going to be meeting with a lot of people that I class as good friends. I'm going to be doing a lot of learning. I'm quite proud to say I'm a lifelong learner. I've got some great events coming up. I'm talking with ASH, the Association of Secondary Heads in Essex, at their conference. I'm doing the same with Hearts for Learning at their conference. Lots of events between coming up with innovative ideas and trying to create solutions that will help support staff and children in what they do. I'm very lucky that with such an amazing team, I get to spend time out learning and sharing around the world. And for me, that's why, I'm very blessed that I get up in the morning doing something I love.
Are you, when you're asked to do these events, do you get license on what you talk about, or do they often ask you to specifically look at areas of EdTech and your expertise?
Sometimes the conversation is, how would you talk about AI in education? Sometimes it's, what do you think is an important topic that people need to know about? Sometimes I'm talking about school and multi-academy trust growth and governance and the broader picture of how we create that capacity at leadership level within our schools for growth. My view is, if it's something within the wheelhouse of things that I know about, I really want to deliver not the answers in many cases, but the questions, what you need to be reflecting on in your schools. Every school, every cohort of teachers and students are different. So who am I to be suggesting you should do? What I can do is say, here are some questions, here are some frameworks you could follow that will help you on your journey that little bit quicker. And that's what I try and do.
Al, we've got to talk about the tweed before we finish as well. Are
Oh dear.
you sponsored? Is there different brands? Can you allow? Are you contractually obliged to talk about a specific supplier of the tweed jacket? How many tweed jackets do you have?
I'd be very chuffed if anybody wanted me to sponsor me for anything. Listen, I do like my tweed jackets. This sounds very old, doesn't it? Personally, I like them. And secondly, I always like to have a few pockets when I'm out and about. I probably have one or two too many tweed jackets. On occasions, I've seen one and thought, I really like that. I'm going to get that. And I've got home and realized I've already got one the same, but that just shows I've got good, consistent choice. But it's become a bit me. It's what I'm comfortable doing. I don't like to take myself too seriously. Anybody who reads my newsletters and my social posts will get that. I don't like the grey suit, the formality of going to events. So for me is my halfway house. You take me as I am, and I'll be open and frank with you. But it always creates a chuckle. But you know what? At some point before I retire, I'm determined that I'm going to come back into fashion. I'm just waiting on it.
Do you know what? Al, I think you're there. I'm not joking. I think you rock the tweed. It took me. I've always had a bit of a problem with the PE having to wear the collar. So when I stopped teaching, I was quite keen to wear the youHQ t-shirt. John, as a golfer, likes the polo, but no, it's all about the confidence, as Gokwan would say, Al, and you're rocking that tweed. So you keep it going. It looks great.
Bless you. Thank you.
Al, I think Sophie's already put on the bottom of your socials. Do you want to just remind people of where they can find you?
Or you can find me in all sorts of places. There you go. Al Kingsley on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, which is Al Kingsley _edu. If you want to look at the articles that I've shared or books I've written, well, not surprisingly, alkingsley.com. And I'll always encourage you, come and have a look at netsupportsoftware.com. We do loads of cool tools for schools. And anybody who's dealt with NetSupport will know that our philosophy is come and have a look, come and have a play, take them away. And if they're right for you, then great. And if they're not, maybe we'll talk another time. So we don't do the hard sell approach to anything.
Just a great team. And I'm not just saying it, we stepped into this and I didn't have a clue what I was doing when I stopped teaching, and then got thrown into these exhibitions. And NetSupport, we're always very willing to be just kind, actually. And that's obviously what we're about at youHQ. It's that kindness, that support. We've been out with your team. They don't know us, but they've been really supportive of us all the way through. And yeah, thank you again for coming on. And it's been really lovely having you back on and me asking you some questions. And I think, anyone that, whether you've heard Al speak before or not, he knows so much about EdTech and what's going on. And with all his various different hats that we've mentioned, the newsletter is fantastic as well. So, if you're on LinkedIn, get on that newsletter. It's really interesting, a really great summary of what's going on in the world of EdTech and beyond. And again, Al, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I look forward to part 2 in due course.
Speak soon, Al. Thanks very much.